The Supreme Court's gun carry decision grows in popularity, plus Biden's pistol brace ban loses again in federal court. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski, founder of thereload.com, of course, where you can head on over today and sign up for our free weekly newsletter to keep you up to date on all things going on in the world of gun politics and policy. This week, the story we want to lead off with is we have the latest polling out of Marquette University's law school. Marquette's been keeping tabs on public opinion on the Supreme Court and some of its big decisions over the last few years, in particular the Bruen decision. And its latest round of polling found that the popularity of that Bruen decision is the highest it's ever been.
Yeah, 69%, right? I'm sure they'll make a lot of gun rights activists say nice, but it is the highest approval rating we've yet seen for Bruen. And they do basically explain what the holding of Bruen was, recognizing expanded protections for gun carry, essentially striking down New York's restrictive concealed carry law. So they don't just say, oh, did you like Bruen? They explain in a sentence or so what it was, right? Which is meaningful. I think it honestly probably means, at least the way I would read it, that the general concept of armed self-defense and carrying a gun to protect yourself is pretty popular.
Right.
That's kind of what I take away from it, but it's also getting more popular, which is pretty interesting because you look at the trend on the other side when it comes to the Supreme Court overall, they are not doing as well. I think they're still the most popular sort of government institution, but they're underwater, and they have been since around when Bruen came out, because the other ruling that came out that was much less popular was Dobbs, which undid Roe v. Wade and has been obviously very controversial since then. Whatever you or I or anyone else might think of the ruling, it doesn't poll very well, that's for sure. And I think it's had an impact on the court's standing, probably as well. These different stories about justices taking private flights and things like that probably hasn't helped as well. And just the general sort of polarization of the country. So the court is viewed as conservative now and has 6 Republican appointees to 3 Democratic ones. And so Democrats are less likely to approve of the court and Republicans are more likely to approve of it. And, it would likely, that would switch around if the makeup changed in the other direction. Right? This is sort of something you see a lot in polling these days. Yeah,
absolutely. And on top of that, it's sort of become part of this court itself has become a political football that both each side is using now. And, there's court reform proposals being just dropped into our political discourse. And so that obviously has a negative effect on the court's appearance.
Court. Yeah, Democrats have been particularly aggressive in criticizing the court of late since that 6-3 majority was put, and really even since it was a 5-4 majority under the Bush years, right? And so, and it's played a big role in our elections, right? 2016 played a huge role in that election because that essentially determined the balance of the court. Given that Mitch McConnell blocked Barack Obama's attempt to appoint Merrick Garland, until the election, and Trump won that election and followed through on his promises to appoint the conservative justices, which he got the chance to do 3. But either way, I wish we had more polling on this. We're going to talk about another poll shortly here too. And this is a quality poll. It's from Marquette, which is well known for polling and polling on the Supreme Court in particular. But it's kind of the only one that asks about Bruen. So it's rough to rely on a single data point like this, but it's all we really have that's more than just conjecture. So they do it every couple months. And really, I guess it's longer than that. It's been a while since they did the last one. But they've just found it's getting more and more popular, which is a fascinating trend to watch.
Yeah, I think it speaks to something we've talked about before, where with the exception of Rahimi, the court's other major Second Amendment cases have sort of been what we've called lagging indicators of public opinion, where the vast majority of the country allowed armed self-defense outside the home. And then in the case of Heller, the vast majority of the country allowed handgun ownership in the home for self-defense.
Yep.
And so court decides on those things, and it's a big deal constitutionally speaking to have them recognize it formally. Yeah. But in terms of the rest of the country, it's sort of the status quo anyway. So that sort of speaks to some of these high popularity, high approval of these decisions, I think.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that is probably one of the effects we're seeing here. It's just that the court has not been pushing beyond where public opinion had already settled on these issues with respect to their Second Amendment cases in particular, because handguns were already extremely popular. That was the whole basis of the Heller ruling, that they are popular.
Yeah.
And they were really only banned in like two places, DC and Chicago. And from there, same thing again with these restrictive concealed carry regimes that they struck down in Bruen. There were only like 8 of those in the country, and which, I guess could probably lead us well into our next subject, which is assault weapons bans, and the court having a real opportunity to take those up. And, there's a similar pattern to where those laws exist as there was to the May issue laws that the court struck down. But we'll get to that in a moment, because the other thing that we saw in this poll was about Rahimi and the court's most recent gun case, which was Cargill, the bump stock ban case. And Rahimi was very popular, right? I think more popular than even Bruen. I think it's up in the 70% range, or, right, a couple points more popular than Bruen. So people liked that decision, which is another thing that we predicted, right? Based on they're probably not going to strike down every the domestic violence restraining order gun ban, because it's something that is in place in almost every part of the country, and is a very popular concept, restricting gun rights for people who commit domestic violence. Now, the restraining order aspect has made it a bit more controversial, right? But I'm not surprised to see that poll very well, the direction they went in that case, because I think, again, it's less about we've focused right on the legal aspect of it and Thomas's dissent and the conservative justice's response to his dissent and all that stuff, and what it means for the Bruen test and everything. But most people probably, when they were asked about it in this poll, were just focused on the domestic violence abuser not having access to guns, which I think is a unsurprisingly extremely popular position in the United States. But so perhaps, although I guess here's an area where our idea maybe doesn't track 100%, and that's the bump stock ban case, where the court struck down the bump stock ban on procedural, or it's not procedural, but Administrative Procedures Act grounds. It wasn't a Second Amendment case. It was more about the ATF's power and how they went about trying to ban bump stocks during the Trump administration. And that did not fare as well. That was much less popular. Underwater, in fact, I think it's 43%, if I'm recalling correctly, approved of that decision. So another one where maybe, it's kind of expected to be unpopular, because what do people associate bump stocks with, right?
Yeah, just the Vegas shooting and bump stocks. Unlike handguns, bump stocks are not super commonly owned, or were not super commonly owned before the ban, and most people didn't associate bump stocks with. So it was. I'm assuming among popular opinion, it was quite popular to ban bump stocks, just because most people either A, thought they were mass murdering tools, or B, thought they're
only
useless. Yeah.
The only context for bump stocks for the vast majority of people is the Las Vegas shooting. And then you're right. They were novelty items that I think there are only a couple 100,000 of them at most in the country. which sounds like a lot, but there's a couple 100 million guns in the country. So it's a very small percentage of gun owners had these things. And even the ones that did, and I've shot a bump stock back before it was, before the Vegas shooting, years before that. And yeah, it's like a novelty thing to get you something like the experience of shooting full auto without having to go through all of the additional regulation associated with buying and the cost. Really, the cost is the real prohibiting factor for full auto ownership among civilians. But so I'm not surprised that was unpopular. It does go against this idea that they're not necessarily just looking at the polling and saying, oh, okay, we're gonna decide based on whatever is the more popular outcome.
Right.
And I don't think that's what we've ever said. It's more nuanced than that. It's, they're unlikely to strike down a gun law that is in every single state, right? They seem to have gone after these outlier laws with what they're, willing to take up and strike down. So speaking of which, you had a good piece. We talked a little bit about this last week, but you expanded on it and put it into writing. I think it's a good argument as to the Maryland assault weapons ban being upheld presents a real opportunity for gun rights advocates to get an assault weapons ban case before the Supreme Court, which would be this sort of archetype where there aren't that many states that have these laws, and they're targeting something that's extremely popular, namely the AR-15, which is the most popular rifle in the country. So why don't you take us through just the basic outline of your thinking on that, on why we'll start with why they think they would take it up.
Sure. Yeah. So gun rights advocates are expected in the coming weeks to file a cert petition in that case after the Fourth Circuit upheld it.
The Second Amendment Foundation already said they were going to do that, right?
Yeah, they've already announced their plans, and they've got some time to do so, but it's inevitable that they're going to try, obviously. And there's obviously some factors that make it a compelling case to get there. It's a final judgment, and we've talked about before how the court has resisted taking up assault weapon bans cases that were not at final judgment in the past, and they've said as much specifically, at least Justice Thomas has. Right. And so they finally have one. It's an en banc decision, so there's nowhere else for it to go but the Supreme Court. And the fact that Alito and Thomas have already opined that they want to take an assault weapon ban case. So that's 2 of potential 4 justice block that would vote to take up a case. So that, that bodes well. And plus the procedural history of the case. This was already a case that was before the Supreme Court when it was deciding the Bruen case. And after Bruen, it GVR'd this exact case back down to the Fourth Circuit. So it already had its eye on it. And the way the Fourth Circuit handled that GVR, I think, could also maybe raise a couple justices' eyebrows, because listeners might recall that they heard the case almost immediately after Bruen. So they reheard the case almost immediately. And then for over a year, they just didn't decide anything, and no one really knew what was going on.
Yeah, the panel below the en banc panel.
Right. And then the en banc panel out of nowhere said, we're actually going to take this en banc before a decision from the panel had ever been rendered. And
Very
then at
unusual.
least if the dissenting opinion in the Bianchi case we covered last week is accurate, that's because there was a judge on that 3-judge panel who was going to dissent from what was going to be a ruling striking down the ban. Mm-hmm. He just didn't disseminate his opinion and waited and held it and until a separate case. Yeah,
that was on purpose, perhaps, as a sort of
he called
pocket
it a pocket. Right. He called it a pocket veto to avoid pro-gun precedent, essentially. And
because there was another gun case coming up along the same time where the panel in that case upheld one of Maryland's gun laws, using Bruen. And, for the sort of precedential purposes, the judges who are less favorable towards gun rights on the Fourth Circuit wanted that to happen first.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
Yeah. And if that's at all accurate, I have to imagine the Supreme Court would at least take a look at that, because that sets an interesting precedent that you can just, play games to avoid certain precedents. And I would think that the court might want to avoid that. At the same time, there's factors cutting the other way, right? Mm-hmm. So those obviously make it a compelling case and probably the best opportunity that they've had so far. But at the same time, there isn't a circuit split on this question. And we've talked about why circuit splits are very important. The court likes to wait until its lower courts have come to opposite conclusions for it to be prompted to step in and sort of address that.
That's its primary purpose, is to settle the lower court disagreements.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we've talked about before why it's unlikely that a circuit split will ever materialize on this question, because there's just a handful of assault weapon bans. They tend to be located in liberal states, which are under very liberal circuits that think like the Ninth Circuit, the Second Circuit, where New York is, where you're unlikely to see a ruling striking down the assault weapon ban. And so that makes it probably a little bit challenging to see a scenario where the court's compelled to take it up. And plus, the court is going to be quite busy, I think, with other gun cases in the near term. They've already taken up another ATF rule. The so-called ghost gun kit ban from the Biden administration is going to be heard this term. The felon in possession sort of brouhaha that we've seen broiling in the appellate courts. There's at least 5 that were sent back down by the court after Rahimi, and one of them is already back with the same exact decision that it reached beforehand. Just
kind of what we all expected.
Right. So I think the court, I just think, has its hands full with a lot of gun cases and may not want to take 3 or 4 gun cases per term going forward. That's certainly not what they've done in the past.
And the GVRing of those other cases that they could have taken up after Rahimi, and that I think like everybody on each side wanted them to take up because the government wanted them to take it up. And certainly a lot of gun rights activists wanted them to take up a number of these cases that they ended up tossing back down to the lower courts. So I don't know. They've been fairly active on this issue over the last 2 years, right? Since Bruen, for the Supreme Court, which is not a super, first of all, as you mentioned in your piece, like they're taking fewer and fewer cases. As we talked to Dave Kopel a few episodes back, where he described this, or we had an episode a little while back where we talked about that.
Yeah, I think it was Jonathan Adler.
Yeah, it was Jonathan Adler. You're right. And now they're taking a higher proportion of gun cases compared to their overall cases. But I don't know. It's hard to say. And you gamed out a little bit of the idea of which justices might be on board. As you mentioned here, you got Alito and Thomas already. Kavanaugh ruled against DC's assault weapons ban in Heller too. He was in the dissent, though. So, that's another one where you at least have him on the record, what he thinks about. He kind of originated the history and tradition test in that case. Yeah. So you would think he'd be on board, but you can't be totally sure because that was a dissent in a three judge panel case where you don't have the same process for taking up cases as you do at the Supreme Court, where you need 4 judges to say yes. And then, obviously the next, the other 2, because I think we were pretty well confident on what the liberals on the court would do. They've all been in pretty tight lockstep of not really wanting to strike down any gun laws at all, ever. They were all opposed to Heller in the first place. Even Jackson has essentially said that now that she's on the court. But so you would expect that those 3 would vote not to take up an assault weapons ban case, and if there is one, that they would vote against striking down the law. I think that's pretty plain enough. Like you don't need to read a lot of tea leaves there. But yeah, Roberts and Gorsuch and Barrett, it's a little less clear where they're leaning on this stuff. Now Gorsuch has joined with Thomas in Thomas's favorite descriptor, which is that the Second Amendment is a second class right, or is treated like one often. I don't know. Look, all 6 were on Bruen. So, but that 8-1 split in Rahimi maybe makes you question some things. But we'd have to see. It would be very surprising, as sort of Thomas laid out in his. It wasn't a dissent to taking up the Illinois assault weapons ban cases, but it was like a concurrence or an explanation that he offered where he noted that this is the most popular rifle in the country. It'd be pretty odd if it wasn't protected by the Second Amendment in Thomas's view. And I would be, surprised if you couldn't get 4 conservative justices on the same page on that point, and then 5 total to get the ruling. But they've been hesitant to do that to this point. So who knows?
I was saying that's what we'll have to see is clearly it's the best chance yet to get there, but that doesn't mean by any means it's guaranteed.
Yeah.
They could decide to hold off.
It just doesn't. I just think there's no way to really know what they're going to do, like you mentioned. But you laid out all the really good arguments for it, and people should read that piece. If they're a Reload member, if they're not, they should buy a membership and then go read it.
Absolutely.
Anyway, what's the next story we got?
So the next story, we have an interesting Fox News poll that came out this week. Obviously, there's been a flurry of candidate polls as we're heading into a presidential election. This one was a head-to-head matchup where it showed Trump up just 1 point over Harris in the overall polls. But what made this one interesting is it asked about specific issues, and guns were one of them. And it asked registered voters, who do you trust more on guns? And interestingly, Trump had about a 3-point advantage in that regard in terms of trust on gun policy.
Yeah, obviously not a huge lead within the margin.
Yeah, very narrow.
But also another situation where I wish we just had more polling. Like the Supreme Court, not a lot of credible high-level pollsters are looking at those questions. And it's the same thing with guns as an issue in this election. You just don't have a lot of the pollsters asking that as a specific issue that they're polling on. Fox is one of the only ones doing it, and Fox News polling is highly rated by all the polling aggregators. So, they are one of the top polling firms, and they use the technique of having partisan pollsters work together. So they have a Democratic pollster and a Republican pollster to try and get as many respondents from a representative sample as they can. And that's one of the reasons why I think they rate so highly in, different, whether it's 538 or Nate Silver, or these other polling aggregators, and how they rate the different pollsters out there. Fox News tends to be near the top of that. New York Times Siena is another really highly rated poll. But either way, I wish we had more, but this is something that we've seen throughout this election, is Trump leading on the issue of guns against both Harris and Biden. So it's kind of fascinating, as you pointed out in the piece, because when you look at the actual campaigns, you wouldn't think that. You would think the opposite was true, because the Harris and going back to the Biden campaign have really emphasized guns, at least as one of their major priorities, because she does a stump speech where she gives the same. This is a common politician thing, right? Outside of Donald Trump, who is, a bit different from most other politicians in his public speaking regard. But most of them give a stump speech and they'll repeat the same things over and over. And what's always included in there for Harris is her commitment to universal background checks, red flag laws, and an assault weapons ban. Ban on sales now is what she's advocating for in those stump speeches. But it's something that's been part of the campaign the entire time for her. And from her very first speech, she was talking about gun control. And for whatever reason, when we've speculated on this, a number of different times and talked through it, but Trump is not doing the same thing. And it doesn't appear that, we talked about this, I think last week or 2 weeks ago. He had a press conference where he did mention guns and gun policy, and he attacked Harris on guns. But he's had a number of events since then. I don't think he's gone back to that as far as I've seen. I don't think he mentioned it on the Musk, I don't know if I would call that an interview, but like talking session or conversation. That's normally like the when they talked on Twitter. They went on, that was like 2 hours long. I don't think they mentioned guns at all. And he did another press conference on the economy where he, as he does, right, he went into a bunch of different issues, but I don't think he mentioned guns there. Although if anybody saw something I missed, please send it to me. But doesn't seem like he's gone back to emphasizing this issue.
Yeah, not that I've seen either. And obviously we covered this pretty well, but took it out of the plot. They took gun policy out of the platform, didn't mention it at his acceptance speech. So
Right.
it is counterintuitive from what you've seen how they've campaigned. And it'd be nice to see other polls on this issue to see how widespread this phenomenon is among voters. But it's just notable that he has a slight advantage in trust on this issue. So
he does. It's not huge, but I mean, his lead is this poll, which I think is, I think Harris was up in the last Fox poll. So, he kind of gained a slight bit in this one, I believe, if I'm remembering right. And you'd expect the person leading to have some advantage in a number of the issues, which he does, but she still has an advantage in a number of the other ones. You've outlined them all in the piece, but you'd think. I haven't seen a poll where Harris or Biden was leading Trump on the issue of guns. Now, the other interesting bit of it, and maybe another explanation for what's going on, is guns are not a top issue in this election for voters.
Right.
That was something the Fox poll also found, right?
Yeah, only 3% said it was their most important issue, and guns tends to be a little bit lower on the list in most elections. But this
Usually
was noteworthy
because issue. I feel like.
Yeah, this one was tied for the lowest among the issues they polled.
That's kind of right.
Guns and crime, which is kind of interesting too. Crime is receding.
Crime is way down, so I guess that makes sense to a certain degree. We talked about it earlier this year, but it's only continued to drop since then. I think there was another report from Analytics. We've had Jeff Asher on the show before to talk about this. It's actually where all these news stories tend to come from, because he collects police data. But murder's down again. So it does seem that things are going back to their historic lows. And I guess people are not paying as close attention to that, which probably does affect guns as well, because that's, we've talked about guns as a chaos indicator in the past. And there's just not as much chaos right now as there were like 4 years ago during the pandemic or during the rioting the summer of 2020. And so I guess people are a bit less interested in the issue as a whole.
Absolutely. We'll keep our eyes peeled for other polls if they decide to start asking this question, because it would be nice to have other pollsters actually gauge where people are at on this issue.
Would be nice.
And then the last one from us this week that we want to cover is just we have a new 8th Circuit ruling dealing another blow to President Biden, a different ATF rule than some of the ones we've covered already this episode, the pistol brace rule. Yes. The ATF said that was arbitrary and capricious to reclassify braced weapons as SBRs under the National Firearms Act.
Right.
And
the court said the ATF was being arbitrary.
Yes. Yeah. Good clarification. But
yes,
another rule for the
that themselves. They said the opposite, but the court did not agree with the ATF on that point. And so found this is an interesting one, because if you remember, the rule was vacated a while back in the 5th Circuit, which is sort of like a nationwide injunction, although that's been something that has caused problems with the Supreme Court and other in the ghost gun kit case, right? The court kept fighting with the 5th Circuit on the right remedy in their in how that case went down. So the court hasn't done anything on the pistol brace one yet, though. So I guess they're a little more happy with how that's figured out. But basically, the only reason there was a dissent in this case, interestingly, was that the dissenting judge didn't think that they should be taking up the case because the rule was already vacated. And so it sort of implies that he would have agreed with them, with the majority, otherwise on the merits of the case. But the majority was basically like, yes, it's been vacated, but that might not be enough of a remedy for the plaintiffs involved in this case. And so they didn't really make a decision on what to do about the rule being unlawful. They just sent it back down to the district judge for him to figure out what additional remedies might be necessary. But for our purposes, it's useful as for a couple of reasons. One, it's another setback for this rule, which is the most expansive of any of the Biden era rules, or more expansive than the bump stock ban too, just because of how many people it affects.
Yeah,
There's millions is the low. 3 million was the lowest number that the ATF put out there. Their high end number was 7 million. The Congressional Research Service was somewhere between 10 and 40 million, which is probably, I don't know if 40 million is realistic, but
yeah.
there's only supposed to be like 25 million ARs to begin with. And I don't think there's more pistol braced ARs in the world than there are just general population. But regardless, it was a lot of people affected by this. So, it matters for that purpose, but also because it's the first case that I've seen Cargill referenced in the bump stock ban case of the Supreme Court, where they struck down the bump stock ban. That was referenced in this Eighth Circuit ruling, as they used it as a guide for whether or not the rule is something that can be challenged under the APA, given the details of it. And they used the same process that the Supreme Court used, and then ultimately came to the same conclusion. So we're going to actually have Alex Bosco from SB Tactical on the interview podcast this week. So look for that. He's the one who invented the pistol brace, and he's one of the plaintiffs in this case, which also featured 25 Republican attorneys general, and FRAC too, which is an industry trade group. So, we'll get into more detail there. What it means, where the industry is at, since all this has started, especially the pistol brace, SB Tactical in particular, and the rest of the industry, how they're responding to this stuff. So it should be an interesting conversation. So make sure you check that out later this week, or we'll have it on Sunday for members and Monday for everybody else.
Yeah, listeners should absolutely check that out. And just to hit a couple newsletter headlines before we wrap up here today. One of them comes from Newsweek magazine. There was sort of an interesting development in New York. So a few months back, the Gun Owners of America and a couple of other gun rights groups sued New York City in particular, I believe, because they don't have a process for either A, recognizing out-of-state carry permits in the city, and B, offering their own non-resident permits. So there's some avenue for someone from out of state to carry there. And so there's a lawsuit over that, and it's sort of been dormant over the last couple of months. But suddenly last week, the New York City Police Department initiated emergency rulemaking to establish a new process for non-residents to apply for a concealed carry permit in the city. Now they still have to meet all the same requirements and we've covered before how strict New York makes it. They're very onerous requirements to get a permit, but there's at least now an avenue for non-residents to get permits. Yeah.
And it's also, they still have most of the restrictions that make it really hard to carry anywhere with a permit. So it's, don't expect to be able to go get your permit and then, carry in most of New York City. You can't even carry in Times Square. That's a whole bunch of blocks they've made it into a giant gun-free zone. Those are all, of course, still facing challenges, and I believe the vampire rule, as gun rights advocates call it. You can't carry on private property without publicly accessible private property without express permission. That has been enjoined, if I'm remembering correctly, of what the latest in New York is, and I think the places of worship one as well. Is still enjoined, but broadly speaking, most of the restrictions are still in place pending further legal action, pending the Supreme Court doing something about it, which they've been reluctant to do at this point. But this is something that seems like an obvious problem with some of these Bruen response laws. Is like, the courts basically, the whole point was that you need to let people be able to carry in self-defense. And I don't think that making it so no one else from any other state can do it legally is going to hold up. This happened in DC as well. DC kind of previewed all of this fight back in Wren years ago, where they went through the whole process. They used to have a total ban on concealed carry and all carry. And then that got struck down. And then they put in the May issue law that Maryland and New York and California and Massachusetts had. And then that got struck down years before Bruen happened. And the DC declined to appeal the case because they were afraid they would lose at the Supreme Court. And so instead they went to work on trying to, basically make what these Bruen response laws are to some that theirs is a bit less aggressive than most of the ones we've seen in the rest of the country, somewhat ironically, because DC had always been kind of the most aggressive of any locale for gun restrictions. But one of the key parts of the rulings was that they had to allow a non-resident permit, non-resident applications. So that's why I have a DC concealed carry permit because of that ruling. And so, it's I'm not surprised to see that the places that haven't done that they're probably going to be forced to do it by the courts, or through settlements or whatever over the course of time, for sure.
Yeah. And the last one we want to wrap up with is a headline out of the New York Times. And it's one of the first big indications we've seen of the fallout from the Crumbly prosecution in Michigan. So if listeners will recall, that was the parents of the Oxford school shooter up in Michigan who were actually prosecuted and convicted of negligence, I believe was the criminal negligence of that, because they purchased a gun that was ultimately used in that shooting, and they ignored red flags, and there's a whole sort of
the gun properly,
didn't secure it. And something we speculated, you in particular at the time, talked about, will we see this inspire future efforts? And you suggested that it probably would inspire future efforts. And this story is an example of that. The Santa Fe shooting in Texas, the parents involved in that case, the parents of the shooter, are being sued in a civil trial. So not a criminal trial, but they're being sued for basically a similar accusation. Yeah.
Similar idea. It's not a criminal trial because the shooter was too old for the criminal statute to apply, because it cuts off at 16 and the shooter was 17. That's how the New York Times has reported it. I'm relying on their reporting there. But yeah, if you read through the story that they have, there's a lot of similarities. It's just the same basic argument that now they didn't. There's no accusation that these parents bought the gun for the son, like the Crumblies did. But either way, they had guns in the house. They had them locked up. The Crumblies claimed that their gun was locked up, but that essentially the same thing happened here, where the son found the key. Or I guess in the Crumblies case, he may have known where it was, but it was always a little unclear on that point, whether he knew or he just searched around and eventually found it. In this case, that's what the father is claiming, that he had his guns locked away in a gun cabinet and a safe, and then the keys were hidden. But the problem is it's a very different, and I think this is one thing to take away for your average gun owner from these cases. Not that this is obviously not a very common occurrence, and not that you should be paranoid about your own kids, but there's a very different set of requirements for securing your guns from small children than there is from teenagers, right? They're going to be a lot smarter and be able to figure things out better than a small child. So you need to take into consideration as your kids get older. If you just generally about keeping them away from firearms that you don't want them to have access to, like you got to put more thought into it as they get older. That's just the reality. That's one thing that always strikes me about these cases. It's like, it's just harder to secure your guns from a dedicated teenager looking to get it at them than it is from a 5-year-old. That's just reality. Which also feels like should come into play with, and probably will, with this case. The warning signs in this case don't sound as severe as the ones in the Crumbly case. I mean, the Crumbly case, the parents were called to the school the day of the shooting and shown the messages that their son was leaving, which were all about killing people, and didn't do anything at that point. Neither did the school administrators. So there's a lot of things went wrong in the Crumbly case, but this one, the piece mentions like his search history and that his online behavior was getting worse, and his grades were not doing as well, and maybe the parents weren't as up to date on that stuff as they should have been. But it doesn't seem as severe, at least from what's in the New York Times piece. It just doesn't seem as like, oh, he plagiarized something. That doesn't, most people's reaction to hearing that their kid plagiarized something is not, oh, he's going to be a school shooter. Right. So I don't know, the state's argument in this case is that they were either, they either saw the signs and didn't do anything, or they should have seen the signs and they were too negligent in not seeing them. So it still feels like a high bar. I'm still surprised that the Crumleys got convicted, frankly, in their case, given that these are both cases where the parents did not know of the child's plans, didn't assist them in carrying anything out, and still might be held liable, which is, it's an interesting turn in the law. I mean, people are, they don't like mass shootings, understandably. People are fed up with this kind of thing. And in school shootings, a lot can blame the parents, and maybe there's certainly some blame that can be there. Whether or not it's enough to reach to criminal level is another question. And increasingly the answer seems to be maybe, right? So we'll have to keep following these cases to see how far they propagate and where the lines are that these juries draw.
Yeah, I think that to me is the biggest takeaway from this, is that we're seeing the same strategy tried again, but with a far less egregious fact pattern. And whether or not it's as successful as it was in the Crumley case will be one to watch, I think.
Yeah, less egregious as far as we know right
as
now.
Far as it's been reported. Yeah.
Maybe there'll be more that comes out that makes it look
That's right.
worse. We'll see.
It's a good point. Good point.
Yeah, I guess that's all we've got for this week, though. You got anything fun coming up?
Not fun. Over the weekend, I have to fly to Phoenix for my think tank job, work trip. So I'm going to be in business attire in 100 and probably 20 degrees or whatever it is in Phoenix next week.
That's rough.
Yeah.
I'm speaking at Arizona State University at the end of the month, but I don't actually have to go there. So that's one upside.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
But not having to be in Phoenix in the summer.
In August. Yeah.
If you can avoid that, you should avoid it. But otherwise, Phoenix is a very nice town. Arizona is
a great city.
But not when it's boiling hot out. Same for like Nevada and Vegas. Like I've been used to going to Vegas in the winter, because that's when SHOT Show is, right? The industry's trade show is in Vegas every year in like March, February, whatever. And so it's still warm, except at night where it gets freezing, deathly cold. But and so I went there to review a helicopter machine gun attraction, which was awesome and fun. And people want to look that up. It's on the Free Beacon. Just Google Free Beacon helicopter machine gun. I'm sure it'll come up. But that was in the summer. I think it was like June. And I remember walking out of McCarran Airport. And as soon as you walk out those doors, it's like walking into an oven. Yep. It's insane. Like a dry heat. Yeah, it's a dry heat, but so is an oven.
Yeah, that's exactly what I say.
That's what it feels like. But so good luck. Good luck with that. Maybe try to stay inside most of the time, at least until you can change into.
Thank God for AC.
Some summer clothes. But hey, at least you're traveling. That's nice.
Yeah.
Hopefully that goes well for you. I'm just happy now. I'm back on the we're going to win it all train here for the Phillies after they've been this is incredible. They've been the second worst team in the league since the All-Star break, right? This is remarkable because the worst team in the league is the White Sox, who are like actively trying to have the worst record in history of baseball. It seems like they had that like 21 game losing streak, right? But the Phillies, who are first in the league, first in the entire league forever, and they're still like 7 games up on the Braves for the division. they've had the second worst record since the break. And now they're finally back to like, hopefully winning again. I mean, they won 13-3 last night, and Weston Wilson hit for the cycle. And that was cool. I actually missed it. That's like one of the only games I missed because I went to the fair in Arlington. But, that added to the enjoyment because I didn't have to look at my phone and see terrible news from the Phillies losing to the stinking Nationals. So instead it was like back to form. Here we go. So I'm hopefully that'll keep up. We'll see. But that's all we've got for you guys this week. If you want to keep up to date with what's going on with Guns in America, you can head over to thereload.com and sign up for our free newsletter. We don't flood your inbox. We keep you informed about what's going on without overwhelming you like most every other news outlet, I feel like, wants to send you 100 emails a week, right? We try not to do that. We send you one or two. There's a big breaking news, things happen. We'll send you an alert, but not every week, right? I try to respect the audience's time and attention. And so, of course, if you want to get this podcast a day early or appear on the show in a members segment, which we have coming up this week in the interview podcast, you can buy a membership. It's a great value, I think. It's what keeps us afloat. It's what makes this whole publication possible. So head over and check out our membership options today. But that is all we've got for you guys. Thank you very much.